by natural and human activity, with the natural activity being enhanced by the human. Now, in the Midwest, I believe that soil is produced from under the bedrock, from the activity of plants and so on, at the rate of about a ton per hectare. Under present conditions, it's removed at a rate several times that. So erosion is one of the ways in which agriculture affects health. Now, what is eroded is soil. The soil eventually makes its way into lakes and rivers. In the lakes and rivers, since it carries nutrients and therefore stimulates the growth of algae and bacteria. If a lake or if a pond gets too much nutrient, particularly phosphorus and nitrogen, then you see this kind of blue-green scum on the surface of the water. Now, when that happens, the microorganisms are capturing carbon through photosynthesis. Then they're dying and sinking to the bottom. When they sink to the bottom, they're oxidized. And what this means is that they're removing oxygen from the deeper layers of the water. So there are a number of places in the world where the lower layers of the water are anoxic. The Black Sea is one of those. But if there's a lack of oxygen in the lower layers of the water, then there will not be a suitable habitat for fish, for midges, those are insects, for the insect predators of mosquitoes. So then the lower depth, the anoxic regions of a body of water become epidemiological sources for vectors of disease. The chemicals that are applied to the land may volatilize and get into the atmosphere, and this is particularly true of the nitrous oxides. Or they may be washed into the soil, get into drinking water, and there are quite a few carcinogens that have been related to agricultural chemicals. The most drastic examples of agricultural chemicals producing medical effects were in Vietnam, where defoliants were deliberately applied to the forests in order to destroy the shelter, the cover that the guerrillas had. But these were toxic substances: Agent Orange, Agent Blue, and Agent White. Agent Blue had arsenic in it, I believe. Agent Orange is like some of the growth substances in plants. And so I had the opportunity of examining fetuses or young children who had been injured because the mother had been exposed to defoliation rays during her second trimester, I think. But there are a lot of other agricultural chemicals that are important: the fertilizers, the fungicides, and the insecticides are the main groups. Agriculture affects the land through mechanization, where the heavy machinery, first of all, compacts the soil, squeezes it. The squeezing of the soil interferes with the reproduction of invertebrates and reduces the fixation of nitrogen. A natural soil can fix something like 100 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. This is done by microorganisms living either freely in the soil or in association with the plants. The trouble is that the fixation of nitrogen as a chemical process is very expensive energetically. We know that when it's done industrially, and large amounts of fossil fuel are used in order to fix atmospheric nitrogen. This was the basis of the Haber process, which Germany developed to produce munitions during the First World War, after the blockade by the Allies prevented them from importing bird guano from the coast of South America. So, fertilizers themselves require a lot of energy. Now look at it from the point of view of nitrogen-fixing algae and bacteria. They expend a great deal of energy in the fixation of nitrogen. So suppose that nitrogen is being provided for them from the outside. Then those bacteria which absorb the nitrogen from fertilizer have an evolutionary advantage over the ones that expend energy to fix their own. So the use of nitrogen fertilizer is one of the ways in which nitrogen-fixing microorganisms are squeezed out of the cultivated fields. So chemical fertilizers then have the paradoxical effect of reducing the fertility of the soil. There are two kinds of nitrogen fixers. There are the ones associated with legumes, the rhizobium, and they're the ones that live freely in the soil. Rhizobium lives around the roots of plants, particularly legumes, not exclusively. They get energy, they get amino acids, they get other nutrients from the legume, and in return they provide nitrogen. The price of the legume pays to the microorganism also reduces the productivity. So roughly, whereas you can get something like half a dozen bushels of grain of various sorts from a cultivated field fertilized with chemicals, you get about half of that if you're planting beans, because the bean plants are expending energy in the fixation of nitrogen. Okay, now, the varieties of plants that are used will also affect the whole agroecosystem. Consider the Green Revolution, and it's widely praised because of the development of dwarf varieties of wheat. Now, the logic behind a dwarf variety is that it has a tough stalk and therefore is less likely to be knocked over in the wind, so you can harvest it by machinery. So in other words, the goal of the Green Revolution was to mechanize agriculture. And farmers would have to buy the heavy equipment in order to be able to harvest the grain. But there are other issues involved as well in the tough straw. One of these is that the tough straw cuts the mouth of cattle, so you get infections. So for people who mix crop raising with stock breeding, the Green Revolution can be destructive that way. Another problem is the following. In a rice plant and in a wheat plant, the grain is produced by the energy captured by the upper leaves. In rice, we refer to the flag leaf, which is the leaf all the way up. In corn, the ear of corn is produced only by the photosynthesis that takes place in leaves above the ear. Okay. So what this means is that a dwarf variety will be depending upon these upper leaves. You don't have as many of them. The straw is tough. In places like Bangladesh, the wheat and rice can be flooded. One of our colleagues, Joseph Hunt, had spent some fruitless years with the World Bank trying to convince them that the Green Revolution should focus on deep water rice. Rice that can grow fast enough to keep above the flood. Because otherwise, you'll be losing the crop regularly in flood time. In order to get the tough straw, you also need chemical fertilizers. The chemical fertilizers cost money. So the farmers have to be able to buy fertilizer, which means selling the crop in order to be able to afford it. They need cash income for fuel to buy the mechanization, and finally for irrigation. The Green Revolution took place in places like the Punjab, where water is scarce. Now, actually, in that region of India, there's a great deal of water, but it's up in the atmosphere and doesn't come down. It's held up there by the dust. So the farmers needed cash income for a lot of different reasons. They became dependent on cash. They became dependent on irrigation. They needed pumps. Now, a hand pump could give you enough water to water the garden. But once the water table falls and you're using a lot of the water, then you have to buy fuel and a mechanical pump. So this is another consequence of Green Revolution technology. Green Revolution fertilizers are mostly providing nitrogen to the crops. Therefore, they're useful for those crops that depend on nitrogen, and therefore for grasses. So where the Green Revolution penetrated, their success was in developing varieties of wheat, and to some extent corn, but not of chickpeas. So one of the things we observed was an increase in wheat production in India at the expense of legume production, chickpeas, other kinds of beans, lentils. You have the paradox of nutrition getting worse while production increasing. And this was true in Brazil by a different pathway, where there are all kinds of beans, black beans, pink beans, white beans, garbanzos, that are part of the regular Brazilian diet. That's food for people. Soybeans aren't. Soybeans are food for cattle and for producing oil, fuel oil, lubricating oil. So the introduction of soybeans with the Green Revolution technologies replaced the other kinds of beans, the eating beans. And once again you had the problem, since the soybeans were exported, of increased production along with increased hunger. Okay, so agriculture then affects human health in a lot of ways. There are some others as well. There's the standing water that you have in the small ponds for irrigation, and those are places where mosquitoes breed. And so the Green Revolution contributes to the spread of malaria. Particularly the rice-growing regions of Sri Lanka are regions that are being exposed now to the spread of malaria. There are other mosquito-borne diseases that are important, like dengue. So all in all then, agriculture is a lot more than the production of food. Now I want to consider something about the agricultural technology. Throughout human history, there have been increases in productivity of agriculture. In some cases, we have good records of this. Starting in the 8th century, the Japanese government kept pretty good records of yields. In England, it started in the 12th century, where the measuring of the yield was important for purposes of taxation. This was also true in British India, where the tax farmers had to know the yields in order to be able to plunder the grain of the peasants. So we do have a history, and we see that yields have been increasing historically. Not only increasing, but also spreading geographically. Now, technological innovations make it possible for the grain cultivation to spread. For instance, valley land is good for the cultivation of grain. Hillsides are more of a problem, generally colder, harder to cultivate. You get thicker soils, soils with clay. So what happened is that as population grew, people innovated technologies, and they allowed them to spread into soils of different kinds. The development of the steel plow, the iron plow, made it possible to break heavy soils and therefore to extend agriculture to other parts of Europe. So you have a history of agriculture spreading northward into Germany, the Low Countries, Scandinavia. Agriculture is spreading. People develop varieties then that are suitable to these soils. For instance, rye. Rye is a grass which is derived from wheat. It originally appeared, apparently, as a weed in the wheat fields. It resembles the wheat enough so that when people harvested their wheat, they harvested the rye as a weed. So therefore, human activity provided the force of evolutionary selection, favoring kinds of grass that could sneak into the wheat harvest. So there are these, throughout the world there are weeds that are able to disguise themselves as crops and spread with the crops. So now we have to consider the notion of agricultural progress. And here we come to a really critical idea. One view of progress is that progress is a linear sequence of improvements from less modern to more modern, from less developed to more developed. It's a single sequence, and therefore the task of the less developed is to catch up with the more developed by following the same pathway of development. Now this carries with it then a number of different components for what happens in agriculture. One of these is presumably there's an evolution from labor-intensive to capital-intensive production. The labor-intensive clearly is manual labor or driving oxen. By the way, the development of the iron plow made it necessary to use oxen. That was simply too heavy work for people. Oxen need food. The food has to be cultivated. And so in Northern Europe,